A little SMR for you right there up top. Won't do too much of that because that's nasty. But let's see. Next up is chapter 55. Oh, this is the writing process. I'm reading day one, book four, chapter 55, Sophros. He didn't know why he'd done it. It made no sense. Here he was, hunting Samuda, presumably to slay or disable her, and he'd helped her win the fight. He could rationalize his decision. There was no way of knowing what might happen if she lost. This way, she was still under his supervision. But truthfully, he had no good reason for doing it. He'd acted without regard for his duty. Strange. I just realized I hadn't started the recording. So let me start that again. All right. Book 4, chapter 55, Sophros. He didn't know why he'd done it. It made no sense. Here he was, hunting Samuda, presumably to slay or disable her, and he'd helped her win the fight. He could rationalize his decision. There was no way of knowing what might happen if she lost. This way, she was still under his supervision. But truthfully, he had no good reason for doing it. He'd acted without regard for his duty. Strange. The next 20 minutes was spent following her back out of the mountain. Thankfully, he didn't meet any more spiritual inhabitants of the fortress. Once she'd reached the lower gate, she allowed herself to take a breath. He studied her thoughts, wandered through her memories, did his best to learn everything he could from his ethereal hiding place. Her topmost thoughts were strategic, related to her next mission. She planned the assault, calculating all the variables. She'd storm the rear garden with a small team, while her allies set fire to the apartment building across the street. It would be designed for maximum smoke, which should draw any acolytes and their guardians into the street to help those affected. Once they were inside, she and her team would move from room to room, slaying the heroes. It was a good plan. Sophros admired her analytical mind. But of course, he wouldn't allow her to achieve her ends. It would be smarter to kill her or do something to derail her. So why did he simply follow and watch as she wove her plan? And Portillion had a girlfriend? I don't know. I don't know why I wrote that in here. I guess because Maki mentioned something about it in an earlier chapter. I'm not sure. Strange. That's the kind of thing like you might write on a whim, like maybe I was high or something, and then you do more with it ahead of time, so it makes sense. All right. Chapter 56. Joran. Joran wasn't amazed easily. He'd been a member of the Royal Guard. He'd seen his share of magical and scientific marvels. He'd done battle with more than one unholy creature, the necrotic merely the most recent. He'd explored a dozen ancient temples, witnessed a handful of occult witnessed a handful of occult ceremonies. He'd faced down more than one bloodthirsty killer and killed a few as well. This was altogether a different level of amazement. They'd descended the steps through layers of ancient construction. He recognized the first three as previous demolitions of the goddess's temple: the Great Calustria Fire of 1297, the collapse of reason in 885, and the razing of the capital in 897. Below that were two levels of crypts from when Calustria City was little more than a few tents and a sheep station. In those days, Zora was but one of several lesser deities, her practitioners forced to worship in secret to avoid discrimination and at times persecution. Finally, in a comically small grotto, Barillon produced a scroll, read a few words, and touched the stone wall. It opened to reveal another staircase, which opened again into a cavern even larger than the conduit level of Antares 1. Light sprang into life as they cast their gaze around the vast expanse, the light itself emanating from floating wicker baskets filled with some unknown gas. As the steps stretched out across the distance, Joran could see round landings with no visible supports. Where the path defied gravity, the cavern's size defied logic. This was truly a magical place. Joran couldn't help imagining that this was the true home of the gods. All were silent as they walked the final few steps to a pristine white marble disc crowned with glowing golden arches, curly-cued as if molded by a giant artisan. Beyond the arches, there flowed a whiteness so clear nothing beyond could be seen. I'm not sure whiteness should be clear. That's, I mean, unless that's poetry, that doesn't quite work. There flowed a whiteness so total, maybe. Give that a shot. There flowed a whiteness so total, nothing beyond could be seen. Fuck yeah. Love that shit. Let's see. Was there anything worth saying about that one? Joran, no. Which one was that? Yeah, Joran counsels Aeon. No. Did I skip it? Oh, I went backwards. That's why. Monkey fights Darwick. Joran descends into the crypt. Yeah. So yeah, have we seen? I don't think we've seen anything magical yet. We've seen everything has seemed pretty grounded to this point, I think, other than like, you know, faster than light spaceships that have their own gravity, uh, like every other sci-fi convention. But yeah, this might be the first big magical thing we've seen in terms of architecture. Let's see. So I love this. It's another Sand Demon chapter. This fucking guy. Okay. Chapter 57. Sand Demon. How can this be? Goddess, this is surely nothing I could ever imagine. An ancient underground temple imbued with celestial light. Gates that open on their own, strange wispy shapes wandering above, curling around massive white columns. The music of harps in the distance, that never gets louder. Is it possible? Is this the fabled city of peace? He remembered the stories grandmother would tell, but he'd never imagined it could be real. What did this mean? Were the ancient heroes of Therismia real? His heart pounded. Was he truly worthy of this honor? As the last of the crowd filed in, the gates shut behind them on smoothly working tracks. They locked with a musical flourish, the mysterious light pinging off the latch in a swirl of deflected rays. Itch my nose. I don't know if that's a weed or what. At that moment, the light began to dim. The distant music receded, the whiteness slipped away, and the illusion came to an end. The chamber was stark, dank, and nothing remained but a circle of stone at one end, nearly 80 feet in diameter, the base connected to the earth by a set of 3 large steps 60 feet across from end to end. Gods, Sandemon felt himself utter as he took in the terrible majesty of the Null Gate. He could feel his chest tighten as he realized what he was seeing. A series of twisted murals around the edge of the circle, broken every few feet by a pod filled with a reddish goo, a disturbing humanoid shape nestled within. A deep crimson glow permeated everything, splashing across their faces in twisted, ugly shadows. Barillon shot him a dirty look. It was clear who was in command here. It was then that the sound of marching boots rang through the chamber. From a foggy mass to the right of the gate, a squadron of house soldiers came into view. Above them towered a cybernetic elephant with Reynold stargazers seated atop. A pair of marksmen covered the advance, suspended from either side of the creature on painted leather harnesses. At the forward line of the soldiers, pikemen marched, stamping the butt of their spears on the ground between their boots. "Halt!" The young officer's voice rang out, strong and amplified. No one said a word. Oh man, the inevitable confrontation. Here we go. Y'all ready for this? Chapter 58. Ayanna and Reynold. The priestesses and their retinue studied the new arrivals. Reynold disembarked and left the group, crossing the distance and removing his gold-threaded gloves. He laughed and high-stepped it over to Ayanna. Ignoring the look of pride from Barillon, he reached out to hug his sister. She dipped her head instead. Reynold didn't know what to do. No one had told him if a junior family member held rank over the senior if they themselves had higher status. He looked around briefly, then gripped Ayanna by the arm. Her guardian stirred, but she waved them off. She held her brother's other arm for what seemed like hours, but was probably only seconds. He leaned back and studied her dark face. "Sister, It has been too long. She steeled herself. This was a different man than she remembered. His eyes were clear. His voice was steady. He was no longer the dissolute adolescent. He was a man. She couldn't help but think of their father. Would he recognize this handsome stranger? Why are you armed and with this flock of gunmen? He looked back, shrugging to downplay their importance. In these dangerous times, a householder must protect oneself. Clearly, you've made the same calculation. He was right. They were definitely facing a dangerous situation. The game of blood was all around them, and the noose was tightening. If she were not protected by her new position, no doubt her mother would have donated some of her own detachment to protect Ayana. Let me say that differently. Let me give that another read, as we say in the business. If she were not protected by her new position, no doubt her mother would have donated some of her own detachment to protect Ayana. Reynold tipped his head, then stepped to the side. He knelt down and dropped his eyes. She turned to see who he was showing honor to. It was Durian. I don't think it is Durian. I got to change this. I got to give this guy a different first name because they're two different guys. It was um uh, hmm. This is hard coming up with a name on the fly. It was whatever Henstress, Lizette Marshall's high colonel. The preening bastard was loving the attention. Yeah, I don't think it should be him because he doesn't work for Reynold. That would be a shocking development. Well, I'll just read it the way I had written it since I haven't edited it properly. It was Henstress, Lizette Marshall's high colonel. The preening bastard was loving the attention. Rise, my charming pupil. You need not show honor to this old rascal. Come, give me a hug. Smiling, he held his arms wide. Reynold rushed forward and they embraced. Was this her brother's fatherly replacement? She felt a turn in her stomach. She didn't trust the man. She feared, therefore, that perhaps she could not trust her brother by extrapolation. This feeling of shakiness was something her mother had no doubt intended. She was always putting Ayana off balance. Typical narcissist behavior. And yet, knowing what she was up to never made it any easier. Oh, here we go. The weirdest thing about it was that this man served Marshall and not her mother. Were they allied in this operation? Barillon lightly touched Ayana on the arm. Beloved mother, the statue, should we not reveal its significance? Ayana looked tired. What's the point? It looks like they know the tale better than we do. It was all coming down. The legend of Ayana the Brave, the crypt from whence all the evils of the deep came forth, the door that was closed. And here they were, preparing to open it once again. She couldn't believe it. Why in the name of the goddess would they do such a thing? A voice boomed out from behind the party. Because the time of devastation is upon us, sister. The power of the goddess is needed once again. She stared agape at the form of the matriarch, floating through the crowd amidst a sea of white light. As she stepped down to the earth, she wobbled on her cane. Everyone stepped back to give her room. The matriarch stood and stared up at the gate. The time has come for a new band of heroes, and you, sister, will be at their head. Ayana's mind swam. She'd never before so wanted to take to her bed. Her brother and Barrelon held her as she lost control of her muscles. The last thing she heard was the slow, haunting tick of an unseen clock. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. Tick, tock. Hell yeah. So that's Sayana and her brother. And apparently, this is when I decided that Durian was the first name of Colonel Henstress. And it all breaks down because Jorn would have recognized him, right? Because of his working with Lizette like for 30 years or whatever. She would have met him. He would have met this guy at least once. So, um, but either way, he's bad news. Whether he's a turncoat for double agent or whatever, or just a regular old secret guy. But anyway, the Null Gate, we finally get to see it. Um, we haven't even gotten to see like I think one character got in to see the Null Gate. There's more than one. They're like on different planets or whatever. And there was one in the location in season 2 of Shattered Worlds RPG, which is my podcast set in this universe. And one guy went in there and saw it, and then everybody had to leave. They've been kind of kept secret for hundreds of years. There's all this lore around them or whatever, but this is the first time we get to see it, and yeah, it's a big deal, man. I would recommend you check out Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell if you haven't read it. It's a delightful British book. But for me, one of the most compelling things about it is this kind of liminal space. It's like a way to span large distances in short amounts of time. And the way I described the stairs down and the platforms without structural support or whatever, it's kind of almost totally lifted from Jonathan Strange. So check that book out. Some of the stuff in season 1 of Shattered Worlds is kind of stolen from that as well, and a little bit of the Citadel from Game of Thrones. But that's the thing, great art you steal. You just take the best of everything you love and weave it together. They say write what you know, like be inspired by the things you love, things you are interested in, things that you have an emotional connection with. And that's what I did with these books. And whether y'all like them or not, I feel like deeply joyful when I read this shit back. So I think that's a sign of a good thing that you put all your time and energy into. So I'm excited. Stay tuned. Next up, Portillion.